Just before dawn on 7th of June 1917, the earth at Messines Ridge in Belgium erupted. 19 enormous mines, secretly planted deep under the German lines, detonated in a carefully timed sequence. The blast was so powerful it obliterated the crest of the ridge and instantly killed thousands of German soldiers. British General Herbert Plumer had predicted, "Gentlemen, we may not write history tomorrow, but we will certainly change the geography." And he was right. The explosions tore a chunk out of the landscape and left 19 giant craters pockmarking the battlefield. It was one of the most dramatic victories of the war, and it was achieved not by artillery or infantry alone, but by tunnellers, men who fought underground. This is the story of those tunnellers, the secret soldiers beneath the trenches. Before we follow Alphonsus or Albert Edwards, my great-grandfather, and his journey as one of these men, we need to understand more about the world that he was about to enter. Who were the tunnelling companies? Why did they exist? What skills did these men bring from home? And why was tunnelling so critical to success on the Western Front? The First World War quickly sank into stalemate in the trenches of France and Belgium. By late 1914, opposing armies faced each other across fortified lines that barely moved. Barbed wire, machine guns and shell fire made any above-ground advance deadly. So the fight for advantage went underground. By January 1915, British commanders discovered that German engineers were already mining aggressively beneath their trenches. Lacking countermeasures, the British raced to form specialised tunnelling companies. War Minister Lord Kitchener approved a plan put forward by engineer John Norton Griffiths, who had experience digging sewers through heavy clay. He argued that the same techniques, including clay kicking for silent digging, could be applied to warfare. By mid-1915, the British had raised the first 10 tunnelling companies, composed largely of experienced coal miners recruited from civilian life. These new units opened a completely new battlefront below ground. Tunnelling companies operated semi-independently, working closely with infantry units holding the trenches above. Their mission was straightforward in concept, but tremendously dangerous in practice. Undermine the enemy before he undermines you. Tunnelling companies were responsible for a wide range of underground tasks. Offensive mining involved digging shafts under enemy front lines and filling chambers with tons of explosives to demolish enemy positions. At the Somme in 1916, British miners blew a huge mine at La Boisselle, the Lochnagar crater, an explosion so massive it left a gaping crater that remains to this day. The most spectacular success was at Messines in June 1917, when coordinated mine explosions instantly killed roughly 10,000 German defenders and paved the way for Allied victory. For defensive mining, constructing deep underground dugouts and shelters where troops could take cover from artillery bombardment was a key role. Tunnellers built networks of subway tunnels to move soldiers and supplies unseen. Prior to the Canadian assault at Vimy Ridge in April 1917, tunnellers dug an elaborate system of subways and caverns, even linking old limestone quarries, which allowed 10,000 Canadian troops to assemble below ground and then burst directly into the German lines. These preparations were instrumental in the stunning success at Vimy. In countermining, The companies listened for enemy tunnellers and intercepted them underground. Tunnellers on both sides played a lethal cat-and-mouse game in the darkness. They used stethoscopes pressed to tunnel walls to detect digging. If enemy miners were close, a company might quickly drive into a smaller tunnel to meet them and detonate a camouflage, a small explosive charge to collapse the enemy gallery. Often these subterranean duels ended in brutal intimacy. Sometimes opposing teams broke through into each other's tunnels, resulting in desperate close-quarters fights with shovels, bayonets, or revolvers, deep beneath the earth. All of this made tunnellers critical on the Western Front. Later, even as the war became more mobile in 1918, tunnelling units remained invaluable as engineers. In fact, on 4th November 1918, just a week before the armistice, the first Australian tunnelling company was fighting at the Sambre-Oise Canal, helping build a floating bridge for advancing tanks. They lost 4 men that day, among the last Australian soldiers to fall in World War I. When the call went out for tunnellers, the British Empire looked to its mining communities. Australia, with its rich mining history, was a natural source of manpower. The Australian colonies had been shaped by the great gold rushes of the 19th century, a flood of prospectors that quadrupled Australia's population in just 2 decades, exploding from 438,000 in 1851 to 1.7 million by 1871. In mining boom towns like Ballarat and Bendigo, generations of men had honed their skills in gold, coal and mineral mines. By 1914, thousands of Australians knew how to swing a pick, shore up a tunnel and handle explosives. In early 1915, 2 eminent Australian geologists, Professor Ernest Skeets of Melbourne and Professor Edgeworth David of Sydney, realised that Australia's miners could make a unique contribution to the war. With their advocacy, the government raised the Australian Mining Corps in late 1915. Recruitment specifically targeted men with mining and engineering backgrounds. By February 1916, around 1,300 officers and men had gathered in Sydney. On 20th of February 1916, they boarded the troopship HMAT Ulysses and steamed off towards Europe. Arriving in France in May 1916, the Australian Mining Corps was then split up into 3 independent Australian tunnelling companies, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd, plus 1 specialised unit for heavy bore drilling. The first Australian tunnelling company had its baptism of fire in the infamous Ypres sector of Belgium. In May 1916, the first company relieved the British 175th Tunnelling Company in the carnage of Huhay and Railway Wood near Ypres. There and in nightmare localities like Hill 60, Australians took over extensive underground works and joined the ongoing duel beneath no man's land. British officers, initially sceptical of these colonial recruits, were impressed by their work ethic and know-how. The men of the tunnelling companies were a breed apart. They called themselves diggers, with pride. Recruited from mining towns across Australia, they brought a wealth of practical experience. Many were older than the average infantryman. Some were in their late 20s or 30s, even 40s, and quite a few were married men with families. These were seasoned workers who had shovelled coal, sunk mine shafts, or blasted rock in civilian life. What set them apart was their expertise. The Australian tunnellers were recruited from coalfields and mining regions across Australia, and their underground know-how was considered so secret and vital that their work was highly classified, barely publicised until long after the war. Physically, tunnellers tended to be wiry and strong rather than bulky. A man who could crawl through a narrow shaft, swing a pickaxe in a confined space, and endure hours of back-breaking labour in stale air was more useful than a strapping parade ground specimen. They were also chosen for their temperament. Underground work required calm under pressure and an ability to keep your head when literally buried alive in darkness. Not all tunnellers were trained miners by trade. The companies also included carpenters to timber the shafts, blacksmiths and mechanics to maintain pumps, electricians to run lighting, and motor drivers like Albert Edwards. Albert had been a driver and mechanic in civilian life, and his skills proved valuable for operating the engine-powered ventilation fans and pumps that kept deep tunnels habitable. A particular technique was called clay kicking. In clay soils common in Flanders, tunnellers would lie on their backs on a 45-degree angled board and use their legs to drive a sharp spade into the tunnel face, prying out clay silently. This method generated almost no noise or vibration, making it less likely to alert enemy tunnellers nearby. Any lapse in quiet could mean disaster. One clink of a shovel might tip off the Germans, inviting a countermine explosion to bury the Australians alive. For the tunnellers, danger was a constant companion. They faced all the hazards of trench warfare, plus unique perils in the underground environment. Their work was unrelentingly hazardous over a long period. All three Australian tunnelling companies were in continuous combat for over 2 years straight. The enemy below was trying to kill them at close quarters. If a German mine blew without warning, dozens of men could be entombed instantly. At Hill 60, a notorious hotspot near Ypres, the first Australian tunnelling company endured a sustained duel with German miners through late 1916 and early 1917. In April 1917, a detonator misfired in the Australian underground headquarters, triggering an explosion that killed 10 tunnellers instantly. Over the months of struggle for that hill, approximately 30 Australian tunnellers were killed, some literally lost without trace. Then there were the more mundane killers, bad air and water. Tunnels could accumulate poisonous gases, suffocating unwary sappers. Underground water tables presented constant flooding problems. The work was also brutally physical. Men swung picks for hours in stifling heat, often stripped to the waist in temperatures that could reach 30 degrees far below ground. Cases of exhaustion were common. Many toughened tunnellers suffered from chronic illnesses, trench fever from lice, bronchitis from dust and gases, rheumatism from working in cold water. Later, in the massive German offensive of 1918, the tunnellers were hit by poison gas. In March 1918, near Luce, the first company was caught in a heavy German mustard gas bombardment while working underground. Mustard gas, being heavier than air, filtered into the dugouts and tunnels. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of tunnellers were incapacitated. Men emerged blind, their skin broke out in chemical burns, their lungs scarred by toxic vapour. Albert Edwards was one of them, gassed not once but twice in that week. He survived, but many did not. By the war's end, dozens of men in the tunnelling companies had been killed or died of wounds and illness. Countless more were wounded, and for those who made it home, the war often followed them in chronic health issues. Mustard gas could shorten a man's life by decades. Albert Joseph Edwards returned home in 1919 with damaged lungs and eyes. He lived through the 1920s, trying to raise a family while battling respiratory illness. But in September 1933, he died at just 39 years old, and the Department of Repatriation formally recognised his death as war-related, the direct result of gas poisoning in the tunnels. For many years, the deeds of the tunnelling companies were scarcely known to the public. Much of their work has been classified, and it received little fanfare. Yet their legacy is woven deeply into the history of World War I and into Australian memory. On the Western Front, the ground still bears witness to their activities. The enormous mine craters at places like Hill 60 and Loch Nagar have become silent memorials, overgrown hollows that mark where a tunneller's explosives tore the earth apart over a century ago. In 1955, one of these abandoned mines detonated on its own, likely triggered by a lightning strike, an uncanny reminder of the long-lived dangers left underground. The first Australian tunnelling company is now best known for its exploits at Hill 60 and the Battle of Messines in 1917. The Hill 60 Tunnellers Memorial in Belgium stands where they fought, bearing the simple inscription of dedication. In Australia, their names are engraved on hometown war memorials, though often the nature of their service is not obvious. In a very real sense, the tunnellers earned the nickname diggers even before it became common parlance for all Australian soldiers. They literally fought in the darkness so that others could walk in the light. Every time we recall the massive mines exploding at Messines, we touch the legacy of the tunnelling companies. It's a legacy of ingenuity, bravery, and quiet dedication against all odds. As we move forward in this podcast, we will dive into the personal journey of one such tunneller, Albert Joseph Edwards of the First Australian Tunnelling Company. His story, from the coal town of Maitland to the trenches of France, from the suffocating depths of a gas-filled gallery to the struggle of rebuilding a life after war, is just one small thread in the tapestry of the tunnellers' war. These men were miners, mechanics, engineers, and soldiers. They shaped the battlefield from below and left craters in history. Episode 1 will begin our descent into that hidden war, following Albert Edwards from Maitland to the Western Front and into the depths of Hill 60. Stay with us as we uncover the story buried under a century of silence.